Messianic Aryan Radio. Yeshua is King.
Okay, so the next subject is telescoping history. So Dale begins talking about his telescoping of history and how sometimes being far away, we can't discern correctly because we are so far away. And that images that may appear close together may actually be further apart in distance because of the telescope making it appear closer together. And that we can make mistakes because of that historically. But he also goes on to say that someone 1,000 years in the past could possibly get a better view than our own view today of Abraham Lincoln. So when I brought up Origen, so he says, when I bring up Origen and all these other persons, he's essentially saying that it's very possible that Origen did not know Jesus as well, that well, or the doctrines that well, or that Eusebius did not know the doctrines that well of the church, or that it may have understood, and that we today might understand theology and all of that doctrine better now than they could back then. So he's got a sword swiping in two different directions. One towards the possibility that Origen could be mistaken because he's closer and may not have all the information, and also the possibility that he could be correct because he is far away still. He's still not right next to him, because he throws the argument that Origen is far away, right? Origen is far away, and he's not necessarily close to the, real close to the beginning. So he might have an evolving understanding. And then he says, well, but somebody 1,000 years after him could have a really good idea of what's going on because he's far away and sees more. But couldn't that be used as an argument for Origen? That Origen is not right there next to everyone, so he might have a very good view of everyone. So that view goes both ways, that 1,000 years later, someone might understand better. 200 years later, Origen might understand better than even the first early church fathers. So it works both ways. Kind of ignoring the fact that the telescoping could happen to Dale as well, that it could be happening to Dale being so far away, misunderstanding through his looking glass the actual reality of what Origen knows and what Origen doesn't know. But what is interesting and needs to be understood is that in the last video he was speaking about, and that's podcast 71, he was speaking about how that we didn't have the Didache until here recently. And that we had read about the Didache and we saw things about the Didache, but we didn't know what was in it, and we had a very lax understanding of it. We didn't have it. We just heard about it. But with its discovery, we will be able to read it and find out more about it. But now, if we are going to understand that Origen and Eusebius had books that we didn't have, that we don't have, to speak about things that we've never seen before, information that we've never seen before. And although I do understand that it is very possible that we could have a misunderstanding at a very close range or at a very far range, we today don't have all the information that they had. So to presume that we could see as well as they could have when they had a collection of information that we lack today, that's not a good assessment. In other words, Origen and Eusebius have understandings and have knowledge, had sources that we don't have. That's, to be honest, they have sources that we don't have. The early church fathers had Papias, and they read Papias, and we have fragments of Papias that we're reading from in between others. They understood things better because they had more information, more collection of information than we did. And here's another example as well. We all know that Eusebius, if anyone's studied Eusebius, that know that he had stories about Jesus that is not even in the Bible. He has stories about Jesus. He knows stories concerning the apostles that we've never seen. He knows things about the church history that most people don't even have documented. And so what we need to understand is that Eusebius especially has a great deal of history and a great deal of work that he has done to chronologically describe the history of the church up to his time. So we can't assume that we know better than they when we don't even have access to that kind of information anymore. And by the way, Eusebius is Arian. He has a subordinate view of what Jesus and the Father, and so does Origen. Imagine that. These guys who have these collections of these stories about all of these men and the history of the church from the beginning, including Jesus, all the way to his own time, and he's Arian. You think that if he knew so much about the history, he'd also know a lot more about the theology. And he does. That's why he's Arian. And so does Origen, with bearing in mind the fact that they have all of these sources that we do not. They have come to the point to agreeing that Jesus existed before the worlds and that he is subordinate to the Father. Another thing that must be identified, or at least pointed out, is that the church as a whole had no problem with describing Jesus as existing previously before Mary. There has never been a dispute over that in any of the New Testament. Never has it been a complaint about the existence of Jesus before Mary among the Nicene Council that I know of. When we get to the Nicene Council, the argument is not whether Jesus is pre-existent or not, is whether he's one with. It's about whether he's one with the Father or not. One person or one being or whatever that Trinity thing is. And so it's interesting that for 300 years the church had no problems with the existence of Jesus prior to Mary. The problem was whether or not they were together one. This shows that how long the understanding was so ingrained in the church that it was not even an issue. Now the Church of the Trinity has developed since then, after the church, after the biblical New Testament was written, that was assembled, then we see the formation of the doctrine of the Trinity, which is foreign to what was original, in my opinion, from the apostles. So the doctrine of the Trinity, as far as the Father and the Son being one being, that's new. That's extra biblical. That's after the fact. But it's not, you would think that the original church would at least be fighting over the pre-existence as well, because that doesn't make no sense. But they don't. They don't worry about the pre-existence part. They're worried about, are they one or not? So now we need to understand that it is not even an issue up to 400. It's not an issue. The only thing that's an issue is whether they or not they are the same essence. And that speaks volumes in such an easily understood thing that it's not even contested. So it's not a gradual evolving of the understanding. This understanding is from the Bible, and it's all the way through the apostles, all the way to the early church fathers. So, so what I think is interesting is that when Dale brings up, this is a possibility that could be happening. They could not see it clearly from right close by, or they might not be able to see it from further away, and that this whole argument about possibilities. The problem I'm having with that is that even though you can bring up possibilities, you can bring up all kinds of possibilities on anything. You could say, hey, what happened to this hole in the ground? Oh, well, it could be, it could be a meteor fell from the sky, an alien flew by and shot a hole in the ground. It could be a million other things. It could be anything. So when you use a hypothetical to say, oh, this could have happened, or that could have happened, or this possibility could have happened, or this is what could have happened here in this possibility, you have to prove that that's what's happening. So when you're saying, oh, it could be possible that Eusebius doesn't see clearly enough, or that that Origen doesn't see clearly enough, that's great. It's possible. I grant it that it is possible. But that's not enough to say that you've won the argument with that. You have to prove that it's happening. And in actuality, these guys have more information than you have, Dale. They have more access to more sources and more information than you have ever had. And because of that, you can't say that you could possibly know better than them when they are citing sources that we don't even have right now. to at least start on the same footing, we have to have at least the same equal amount of books. And we know we don't. So we can't assume that. And that's not, I'm not trying to be insulting or anything. I'm just saying that you have to prove that that's what's happening. And with Eusebius especially, you can't say that. And Origen. They both had libraries of works. Seriously. So that's not what's happening in this situation. It is possible in other theological situations, but in this situation, with these two gentlemen, Origen and Eusebius, that doesn't fly. Okay. Okay, so the next section is categorizing Arianism. So in regard to how Dale decides to interpret Arianism, and Dale says that the reason he doesn't like to use Arianism is because it is a negative term, a term that was used in a negative way against people who believe like Arius did. And although I do understand where he's coming from, it doesn't matter. And the example I'm going to give of why it doesn't matter is the word Christian. The word Christian was a negative term. It was used in the same way that Arianism was. But Christianity, Christians over time decided to adopt that word, and not as a negative term, but as a positive term. So there should be no problem with me wanting to characterize my belief with Arius, if I agree with him. Arianism, the term itself, defines what it is. If I were to say to you, explain Arianism to me, you would be able to look up Arianism and explain what it is. If I were to explain monotheism to me, it is a broader term, and to say that Christianity should be described as monotheism it's not a definite enough term. It's too broad to say Christianity is just monotheism. So, although monotheism is accurate, there are differences in other religions that need to be identified, and not to lump all monotheism together and be under one heading and say that is the easiest way to explain them. It's not. But imagine with me for a moment that someone was trying to categorize Christianity, and they only wanted to use the word monotheism for Christianity. And imagine that the Christians themselves wanted to be identified by another name instead of that broad term monotheism. Then you would have a problem correctly defining Christianity, because it is lumped in under a broader term and not allowed a more refined term to be used. So, and essentially that's what I think is happening here, and I honestly don't care whether or not Dale agrees with me or not, because this is my position. And I'm going to keep it this way. And my hope is that I'm going to change the view in the future of the way Arianism is viewed. So, and my hope is that although some scholars may reject the usage of the word Trinitarian for whatever reasons they may have, I know that this belief system is not to be categorized under one single broad term. Unitarianism and the belief that Jesus has existed only since Mary has adopted the term Unitarianism. There is no other term used for that belief system. They just use Unitarianism. Never have I heard anyone who believes in anything, if anyone believes anything, that Jesus existed after Mary only, those people only use the term Unitarian to identify themselves, is what I'm saying. And they've never used any other word to separate themselves from being called. So the word Unitarian is not being used in a broad sense anymore. The word itself has evolved, and now it has been adopted by Unitarians. And I have to say Unitarians because there's no other word to use to describe them. And I'm not one of them. So I shouldn't be, Arianism shouldn't be forced to accept the name or the moniker of some other faith. It's ridiculous. So anyways, and because of this, there's a conflict of interest in identifying oneself with that view. So to be absolutely honest, Arianism is fine to use for me because it is exactly the same as I believe. I use to, so I think that the argument that is a non-issue. The argument, the categorization and all that stuff is a non-issue. And Dale, with all due respect, kudos to you for putting, something in a book as far as categorization. But It doesn't mean that you have the rule to categorize everything you want. To be absolutely honest, I think that you're not being honest in how to categorize in this view, and I think that it is being clouded by your Arianism, your Unitarian view. That's how I feel about it. Although, and I'm just telling you how I feel. So Arianism it is. What it is, and it's easy to be identified. It's the embodiment of what my belief system is. And Arianism, although people would seem to want to cut it up and say that there are many different kinds of Arianism, there's one essential core system, and it is alien to all the other ones. In other words, it doesn't have a similar brother or sister. Trinitarianism is not the same as Trinitarianism, and it's not the same as Unitarianism. It's a category all its own. I mean, no other the subordinate view is not part of either one of these others. So I'll leave it at that. So now we're going to go into the attribute of God and the Obi-Wan Kenobi thing. So Dale goes on to speak about the attribute of God and how an attribute can be identified separate from someone else, separate from themselves, I guess. And although I do understand how an attribute can be used when we're speaking or talking about other things, but we can't use the same rules that we use for humans for God. And the problem with saying that the Word in John 1, in the first chapter, although he agrees with me that the interpretation of the Word is creating and is alive is consistent with the reading, he disagrees with me because of the possibility that an attribute could be spoken of here. But when we speak about God, it is not proper to single out an attribute of God and speak of it as though it were a second person and call it God. That's where the problem comes in. This is essentially what the doctrine of the Trinity is doing. And when he goes, and when he says that it is an attribute of God and that it is speaking about an attribute of God and it is being spoken of as with God, that's when you're separating it. When it says in the beginning was the Word, okay, great, it's an attribute. And the Word was with God, that means it's separate from God now. And the Word was God, that means that not only did we separate it from God, but now we're calling it God also. That's where you're going to get into problems, and that's why. And then if you keep that line of thinking going and you go all the way down and the Word became flesh, and you're saying, well, it's just an attribute of God, then you're saying that God became flesh, and then that person was Jesus, and that's either modalism or Trinitarianism. It's one or the other, but it certainly isn't Unitarianism. So, let's see, where was it? And then he goes on to speak about Obi-Wan Kenobi was sent a message from Leia, and how R2-D2 was sent to communicate this message. And that what he says is that although this is an attribute of Leia, it looks like Leia, it speaks like Leia, it sounds like Leia, exactly like Leia, it's not Leia. He says that it is, it's just an attribute. So she sent it, but it's not necessarily her. I don't know how that helps his argument, to be absolutely honest. But now, the problem is that when we speak about God, we cannot speak about God like we speak about humans. Because if we took an attribute of God and personified it somewheres and also called it God, that would be improper because God is everywhere. And so if that analogy were to say that the holographic image, then we're talking about the analogy that he's using, I'm using for myself. The analogy, and if we were to say that the holographic image itself is Leia, like he's saying that the Word of God in John chapter 1 verse 1 is God. So to say that the holographic image of Leia is Leia itself and treat it as though it were Leia, and let's say that we tried to feed this miniature holographic Leia food, right? We would be wrong to treat it like Leia because it is not Leia. So if this was an attribute of Leia, it looks like Leia, all of this stuff, he's saying that it is just an attribute of Leia. And I'm saying that if you make an attribute of, like if you're to take it and say that this attribute, that this hologram of Leia is actually Leia, which is what Dale is saying, that this attribute is God, it's his attribute, but it is God, then if we were to do that with his analogy that the hologram of Leia is Leia, and we were to treat it as though it were Leia, then we would try to feed it or talk to it, or Han Solo might try to kiss it or whatever. But the point is that it's not Leia. It's separate. And so that's the point that I'm making. In the Bible, it's saying that it's separate. So it's not God. It would be wrong to treat it like Leia, because it is not Leia, but it is an image, it is a likeness of Leia. And so that actually defends my perspective that God sent his son like Leia sent R2-D2, and that Jesus is reflecting the image and likeness of his father. Just like R2-D2 is displaying the likeness and voice of Leia, but it is not to be confused with actually being God in the example in John, or that it is actually Leia in the example from Star Wars, because they are not the same. So it is a great analogy, but it actually lends to what I'm explaining, that Jesus is the image and the likeness of God. He speaks the words of God. He does nothing unless he sees the Father, unless the Father tells him to do it, or unless he sees the Father doing it. So this is exactly what Jesus is doing, is the Son of God. He is the likeness of God. He is explaining the Father to us. So then we go back to chapter 1 of John, verse 18, because essentially the heart of this entire video and our back and forth is that we're speaking about Proverbs chapter 8, but we're speaking about the existence prior to Mary, essentially. And so we shouldn't get funneled into explaining whether or not Proverbs 8 speaks about Jesus, although we do have plenty of proof on that. But John chapter 1 verse 18 speaks about Jesus being the one who explains the Father to the world in the past. And no one has seen God at any time. Now let's repeat that. At any time, no one has ever seen God. But that verse explains that it was Jesus. Couple that with the verses that say that Jesus was creating, and couple that with chapter 1 of John, and all of the other pre-existent verses. Couple that with the verses that talk about the Messiah being from everlasting. Couple that with the verses in Genesis, and when you have and then when you add all of those things together, that Jesus is the image and the likeness, and that he's displaying God in the Old Testament, that he's seen Abraham, and that he was before Abraham, and all of these other things, then you get a comprehensive understanding that in the Old Testament and the New Testament and the early church, all the way up to the Council of Nicaea, Jesus has existed before Mary, and it's never been a problem, and that it's not an attribute, it is Jesus.
Messianic Aryan Radio. Yeshua is King.